Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today we want to talk about ecosystems. What does that mean? What's included in an ecosystem? And the first thing that you want to know is that the ecosystem is made up of all of the abiotic and the biotic components. And abiotic is going to be all the stuff that we talked about, the gases available for photosynthesis, respiration, oxygen, carbon dioxide, the nutrients, all of the water, the available water, the incoming, outcoming, whatever. pH turns out to be really important, whether it's soil pH for plants or water pH for aquatic organisms. Temperature, of course, and then weather actually matters too. It depends on what kind of weather. Do you have a lot of snow? Do you have monsoon? Do you not have weather? Light drizzle, strong storm, whatever. Now, the biotic is going to be all of the living things and all of the products of living things, so detritus. Now, there are really important concepts that you need to know about ecosystems, and succession we've already talked about, right? But we need to understand, what is a critical environmental factor? What are the properties of a community? What does niche mean? And we've talked about population ecology, so we've got that down. Adaptation, natural selection, how adaptation and natural selection lead to evolution. Speciation, right, which is the development of new species, and then of course introduced species, and the last four things on there are they're basically their own days. Okay, so let's start with critical environmental factors. First of all, this is a lot like the idea of the limiting reagent that you did in chemistry. It is the single factor that's going to be in the shortest supply, all right? And a lot of times, remember from the biogeochemical cycles, it's going to be phosphorus in terms of nutrients, but it could be anything. Okay, these things that are these critical environment, well, there's one critical environmental factor, and that is it's the limiting factor. Okay, so each environmental factor, though, has a minimum and maximum level, right? And these are called the tolerance limits. Each individual species, and sometimes each individual, has a range of things that they can tolerate, and outside of those limits, things do not go well, right? And so that range is called the limit of tolerance. And here's just an example. So when you have everything going in the optimum range, super duper species are abundant, okay? But as you start approaching those limits of tolerance, individuals start to die, and you move into the zone of physiological stress, okay? Then you reach that limit, and that is the zone of intolerance or the zone of death, yeah? And that's going to be on either side, whether there's an upper limit for the high stuff and a lower limit for the like not enough. Okay, and then just here's an example with plants. You can see it will really affect plant growth. In terms of organisms, a lot of times what you'll see is that it's affecting the population numbers themselves. With plants, that's going to be true also, but you can also see it in the growth, right? And so at the optimum ranges, you're going to have the maximum growth, because remember, plants have indeterminate growth. And at the not so optimal, the stressful areas, you're going to have smaller plants, and sometimes you're going to have like dying plants, and that goes back to the species, animals too. Okay, so here's your first question. You're growing a philodendron that originally came from the floor of tropical rainforests. One day, you moved it into the bright sunlight outdoors, but the plant died. Which is the best explanation? The plant was just old. The plant was suited for growing in shade, but it received sunlight exposure outside of its limits of tolerance. The plant was probably suffering from a disease anyway, so you didn't have anything to do with it. You really don't have a green thumb and probably shouldn't be growing plants anyway. There's not enough information here for a correct answer to be chosen. Well, let's think about it. What are the qualities on the rainforest floor? What are the physical characteristics? Shade, lots of shade. So if you move that outside here in Texas, there is not going to be consistent shade, and so it's going to receive quite a lot of sunlight, probably outside of its upper limit of tolerance. Okay, so you have your limits of tolerance, and those are going to limit where species can live. So if you look at the climactic and the altitude, if there's not enough oxygen, think altitude or CO2, depending on if you're talking about plants or animals, then the animal can't live there, right? Climactic, if it's too cold, if it's too hot, if it's too moist, if it's too dry, those are all going to limit where species can live. But there are other things that limit where species can live too, and stuff like physical barriers, right? It's very hard to cross oceans. They're very, very big, right? Mountains. Tall mountains, short mountains, really a lot of species can deal with that, especially birds. But really tall mountains like the Himalayas or even the Rockies, they're going to separate. The Andes, really good example there. They're going to separate species. Ice, right? When we have ice ages, or if you just have ice in general, that is going to be problematic, right? And as a matter of fact, the humans that were the ancestors of the Native Americans crossed into, at least some of them. There were some here before that too, but that particular group didn't actually come until the ice started to melt, right? The ice age started to thaw, and they were able to walk into North America. Now, like I said, there were other people here before that got here a different way, also due to ice, actually. So for us, sometimes these things are not really physical barriers, but for most species, they're going to be. Now, food and water are obvious. If there's nothing for you to eat and there's no water for you, then you're not going to live there. If there's too much water, you're not going to live there, right? And then competitors. You may have a species that is totally able to live in a particular environment, but it can't because there is some better competitor that keeps it out. Which brings us to the idea of the ecological niche. Okay? And the ecological niche is not a place per se. Okay? When we talk about the habitat, we're talking about the place where an organism lives, right? What are those environmental conditions in that place, okay? A niche is not that. It's not a physical thing. It's the role the species plays in the biological community, okay? It's the total set of environmental factors that determine where a species' range is, right? So is it a primary consumer? Is something else eating it? What is it eating, right? What is it competing with? All of those things. This all goes into the niche, right? And there are really two types of niches, and you can say niche too. I say niche, but niche is also correct. They're generalists. They have a broad niche. That means that they will exploit lots of different kinds of resources. And then they're specialists, right? A coyote is a generalist. A raccoon is a generalist. But we are generalists. Specialists are going to be, they have a narrow niche. They're going to be species that exploit really, really well very few resources, maybe even one resource. Panda bear and bamboo would be a good example of that. Okay, so when you have the situation where generalists and specialists are in competition, overall, generalists typically win because they can access lots and lots of other resources. However, having said that, specialists are very, very good at the one resource that they have. So what typically happens is that generalists will have a larger range, and specialists will be pushed into that one tiny narrow niche, okay? And we'll talk about that more when we talk about competition. Okay, so here's your next question. The ecological niche for a plant includes conditions where it can be found, ways in which it takes resources from the environment, how it competes with other plants, the enemies and pathogens that challenge it, or all of the above. All of the above, right? All of those things go into the niche. Now, talking about species, there are two different quantities that you need to understand. There's abundance and there's diversity. Abundance is the total number of organisms in a community, right? So if you look at upper school, there are 485 girls in upper school. That is your abundance. Diversity, the number of different species, ecological niches, genetic variation, whatever. This can be defined differently, but if we're going with the Hockaday rule, that made no sense. If we're going with the Hockaday example, diversity might be, well, how many forms are there? There's only 4 forms, but there's 180 individuals. There is a high abundance of each form, right? But then if we started looking at advisories, we'd say there's a huge number of diversity, but the abundance is low because each advisory only has between 7 and 12 people, okay? So diversity is going to depend on what you're actually looking at. Typically, we look at species diversity, okay? Now, these are inversely proportional. Abundance is inversely related to community diversity, right? Go back to the forms. There are 4 forms, right? That's not high diversity, but there are lots of girls in each form. That's a high abundance, okay? The other thing that you want to know is the tropical regions around the equatorial regions. They have the highest species diversity. They have the highest species diversity. And it's going to decrease as you move towards the poles. However, right, the abundance of each species is going to increase as you move towards the poles, because you're still going to have some carrying capacity and a lot of individuals, but you don't have a lot of different species. So for most terrestrial plants and animals, species diversity is highest. This is a review question. In the tropics at the equator. Okay, and here's your next question. Why isn't it ecologically sound to provide rare, endangered plant or animal species with only very marginal habitat? And a marginal habitat is something at the edge of the limits of tolerance, okay? So they would likely be close to their limits of tolerance. They would experience high levels of stress. They would spend so much effort with survival that they would not have much left for reproduction. The quality of the habitat is likely to get worse. All of the above. All of the above. If you are going to try and save an endangered plant or animal species, they need to be in the optimal habitat. They need to be in their optimum niche. Okay, so let's switch topics now and move on to life history. Life history is exactly what it sounds like. It's the events that organisms go through from birth to reproduction to death, okay? And the big life history traits, there are 5. Life history traits are going to be the age at which reproduction first occurs. The earlier the age, the more offspring you can have, okay? The frequency of reproduction, multiple times a season, one time a season. Are there multiple seasons in a year? Is there one season in a year? The number of offsprings, do you have 1,000 offspring at a time, or do you have one? How much parental care is given, because that's going to determine survival of the offspring, and also the frequency of reproduction. Higher rates of survival, but lower rates of reproduction. And then what is the actual cost of reproduction? Those are all things that go into this. So there are 2 reproductive patterns. There are the K-selected species and the R-selected species. We are K-selected species, as are all of the organisms who have fewer offspring. Typically they're going to be larger, but they have a later reproductive age, so the sexual maturity occurs later. There's high parental care, lots of investment there. Most of the offspring survive to reach reproductive age comparatively. They typically do well in stable and environmental conditions. There's a higher risk for extinction, for instance. Lower population growth rate. Carrying capacity is pretty stable, right? And the population size is fairly close to that. A lot of times they're specialists, but that's not always true. And that's on this list, and it's in a lot of textbooks. But I would disagree with that, actually. And so don't count that in like the specialist niche. I would not say that. Also, I would not say high ability to compete. They are typically late successional species, though. Okay. Now, our selected species, these are the ones that are going to have tons of little tiny offspring that are basically adults, little adults that just get bigger, or they are in a larval phase and they're going to have to go through some metamorphosis or whatever. Now, they have early reproductive ages. One of the things about our selected species, though, is because they don't have any parental care or anything like that, they will have lots and lots and lots of offspring, which means lots and lots and lots of them die before they reach sexual maturity. Okay, they typically are small, but because they have these high reproductive rates and short lifespans, they're typically pretty able to adapt to unstable conditions. Okay, they have a high population growth rate, and their population size tends to fluctuate really a lot because they're having huge booms and then die-offs, and boom and die-off. Okay, so those are just the signs there. All right, so generally a species with a high intrinsic rate of increase will be a K-selected species, reproduce later in life, be a specialist, or produce many small offspring. Typically, a species with a high rate of increase is going to produce many small offspring. And this brings us to the survivorship curves. There are 3 basic kind of life history structures. There's type 1, which are the K-selected species. They have late loss, relatively few offspring, but good care. Okay, probability of survival is high. Type 2, you have really, survival is going to happen at an equal percentage no matter what age the organism is. And then you've got type 3, which are the early loss, they have large numbers of offspring, little care, are selected species. Okay? Annual plants and most invertebrates have what kind of survivorship curve? Well, bugs, for instance, are invertebrates. They are early loss. Okay? Early loss. So your fish, amphibian, reptiles, lots of plants tend to be this type 3, early loss. Constant loss, birds, right? Rodents, yeah, those are typically in the constant loss phase. And then late loss are going to be your larger birds and a lot of your mammals, larger mammals. All right, so which of the following is not one of the 4 variables governing population size? Births, deaths, immigration, or lifespan? Lifespan, right? How many organisms are born is going to dictate population size, the number of organisms that die, and then how many organisms are moving in and out. Okay? And so both birth and immigration increase population size, death and emigration decrease population size, and you have closed populations and open populations. If you don't have any immigration, you're a closed population. If you do, you're an open population. Humans throughout history have been exempt from the effects of population overshoots and diebacks. True or false? That would be false. Up until we started really modifying our environment, which is what this course is about, we were subject to the same forces that all other species were subject to. Our population was kept in check, and that is something that we are going to talk about in the next unit. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you next time.